record this. Ah, it's recording. Yeah, there you go. All right. So I don't know who all else is coming this evening, but this was a topic that specifically Samantha wanted. There's Kat right there. That specifically Samantha wanted, and in some ways it's an addendum, or it's.
I'm so sorry.
Go ahead.
Wow. Okay, so my mom just texted me.
Yes. Hold on just a second.
I don't hear.
All right, I'm going to start recording again. Delana, you can do whatever you like, no matter what is going on. You can do whatever you like. All right. So this is an addendum to the previous thing we were doing on astrology, but it's more specific. It's much more specific. So let me go ahead and just, it's not very technical, and there's a lot of graphics in here, and I decided to do this a little differently than I've done other stuff. So let me go ahead and pull this up. You got that? See that?
It's loading.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Come on, dude. All right. Fixed stars are basically the stars that you see. And the reason they were called fixed stars is simply because they were being differentiated from the planets, which wander about the sky. In fact, that's what the term planet means, wanderer. Okay. And fixed stars were recognized before we had constellations, or before, you know, stars were grouped into constellations, the constellations that we know. I mean, that being said, every culture that we are aware of created constellations out of various patterns of stars. But there are always some stars that stand out more than others. And they become sort of the basis, if you will, of what we think of as constellations. And obviously different cultures did not create the same constellations. I'm assuming you sort of figured that out. But what is referred to as the fixed stars are those prominent stars that became the basis for constellations, and that were recognized as being important stars in many, many cultures because of their prominence. So that's the easiest way to understand them. So for example, if we're looking here we think of this as the Big Dipper, right? Because that's what we recognize. Well, so you may know that the Big Dipper is part of a much larger constellation that is called Ursa Major, or the Great Bear, okay? And that was the original, at least in the West, that was the original constellation. And in fact, if you go back to like circumpolar cultures, like in Central Asia and in North America and in Northern Europe, they all make this a bear, which is interesting. They all see this, and they all see it as a bear. They have stories about it. And then later it becomes the Big Dipper. And the reason why this became fun is because of this right here. Because these two point to not Polaris, because Polaris is the current northern star or pole star, but because in this part of the sky right here, that's the point in the sky around which all the rest of the starscape appears to rotate. Okay? And over time, as you will see, different stars have occupied this central spot. So currently it is Polaris. When the 5,000 years ago, when they were just beginning to build the pyramids in Egypt, it was a different star that we call Thuban, which is one of the fixed stars of the constellation Draco. And there have been there have been a number of other stars that have held this position, and we'll look at why. But basically, when we're talking about fixed stars, we're talking about the beginnings of astrology. We're talking about the original astrology. So, I mean, that's the easiest way to think of it. And the reason why I like to use fixed stars, or why I concentrate on fixed stars, is not only because it's easier in some ways, but it's much more direct, and there are some really interesting stories that go with each star. You know, if you look at each culture, you'll find that, you know, all the cultures, all northern hemispheric cultures, revered like Rigel and Sirius and Aldebaran, you know, and all of these different fixed stars that have sort of, or, you know, Fomalhaut or Betelgeuse, that have become sort of fixed in our minds. And they all had different stories connected to them. And this was before became parts of constellations at all. So these are some of the other famous ones. I know I mentioned this. These are the 4 royal stars of Persia: Fomalhaut, Regulus, Aldebaran, and Antares. And this is kind of roughly where they fall. And this is, you know, around the latitudes in Persia, present-day Iran, up into Central Asia. You can see they're not perfect, or not a perfect cross here, but this is laid out over the current astrological zodiac wheel. So you can kind of get a sense of where they are. They're part of other constellations. For example, Regulus is part of Leo. So I'm not going to be talking about each one of these except for Aldebaran, because Aldebaran is actually really important in some other ways. But you'll notice each one of these is a slightly different color. So Aldebaran is kind of got a yellowish hue to it when we see it. Regulus is kind of blue. Fomalhaut is kind of white, and Antares is kind of red. And that's the way we see it, you know, through our atmosphere. And it does reflect the type of star that it is. But these colors and these magnitudes by the ancients were considered to be important. And here's a couple of others. Sirius, which is actually the brightest star at our latitude, you know, your latitude and mine relative in the Northern Hemisphere. Sirius is the brightest star in the sky, next to Venus, which is, of course, not a star, but a planet. And it is part of the present-day constellation of Canis Major, the big dog, right here. And right now, for us, it's in the south, kind of southwest-ish. I can't see it when it rises myself because I've got hills all around me, so I can't see it. It doesn't rise high enough for me to see. So I have to, if I'm gonna check out where it is, I have to take my star map and go outside with my phone and try to figure out where it is. You know, and then this is Algol right here. Now Algol is probably not as well known to you, but in the Middle East, Algol was called the demon head because they saw this constellation differently. For the Greeks, this was Perseus. For them, this was a dragon, like a dragon Scorpio creature here. So they saw this as like part of the dragon's eye. So they called it the demon head. So it really just depends on, you know, where you are and who you are, how these different stars were regarded. And if you go, and you can check this out yourself, if you actually go outside and look at the night sky over the course of, you know, many months, over the course of a year, you can get one of the star apps on your phone, and you can actually trace how all these constellations revolve around the the pole. And that's the kind of thing that people would do. They would look at, they didn't have TV. they didn't have apps, they were going to go out and they look at the stars. They see where they move, tell stories about that. So the reason why fixed stars were important is that they aided in predicting solstices and equinoxes. Because, for example, at certain latitudes, like at the latitude where I live, which is about, 300, 400 miles north of where you are. I'm at the same latitude as Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So whatever that is to you all. So at my latitude, for example, Aldebaran rises almost precisely on the summer solstice, like within a day or two. It's very precise. And it rises just for a moment. It rises just above the horizon in the early morning, and it comes up, and then it blinks, and then because it sort of flashes because of the rising sun, and then the light of the sun causes it to disappear. And so that's one of the ways in which Native people here sighted the solstice. They could figure it out. So fixed stars aided in predicting these because they are much more regular than the moon. The moon does have a cycle. I mean, it has a monthly cycle, obviously, but its longer cycle is 18 years long. So you have to be willing to sit and observe it that long in order to try to figure it out, and I mean, there were cultures that did that, clearly. I mean, we know of them. And certainly by the time of the Egyptians, they were able to, Babylonians and Egyptians and the Indians and the Chinese were able to predict eclipses and things like that. So roughly. So obviously they were watching the moon, but the moon was not regarded as being quite as reliable in the early astrology. In fact, I can't remember which culture it is now. I think actually it was in Mesopotamia among the Canaanites that they referred to the moon as a drunken sailor or something because of how much it varies and changes as it goes around. The big puzzle, the big thing that was in the ancient world that was the puzzle to be solved was something that was called the precession of the equinoxes. All right. And it's the precession of the equinoxes that in fact means the fact that this has continued. This is part of the reason why we know, for example, that all of the signs have actually slipped backwards. And I'm really a Cancer, and Kat, you're really an Aquarius. and I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, Delana, but you're actually a Libra. Like, fuck that.
Don't mind that so much if it gets my moon out of Cancer.
Is this the same thing as sidereal astrology, what you're talking about?
Well, sidereal astrology accounts for this, yes.
Okay.
But basically what the precession of the equinoxes is, and you may understand this or not, but I'm sure you all know that the earth is tipped about not quite 24 degrees from the vertical. And so we have this plane right here, what's called the plane of the ecliptic. And that's the plane that the earth travels on in its orbit around the sun. Okay. And then of course we have what are called the true poles, which is the actual top and bottom of the planet. And then we have the magnetic poles, and these are the poles around which the planet actually rotates. And so we're tipped a little bit. That's what causes the seasons that we have. And what happens is, of course, as the earth is spinning, it's rotating, and it's going around the sun at the same time, it's also wobbling. It's kind of doing this wobble. And it's like a gyroscope. And it takes approximately, it's actually a little less than this. It takes like 25,600 and something years for the Earth to walk, for this circle right here, which you can't see my finger, this circle right here to go all the way around. And that's what causes the pole star to change, essentially. I included this because it includes a variety of YouTube videos that are short that actually, if you want to look at them, you can, if you want to understand more technically what the precession of the equinoxes is. Now, because of this, and also because of slight variations that can occur all the time with the Earth, fixed stars may not come up or rise at exactly the same time every year. And this was noticed. And in fact, when Ptolemy, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, when Ptolemy was looking through the old records, because he was the first person to like compile all of the old records that were available into a single explanation of the precession of the equinoxes and actually, talk about them. He had the math to do it. One of the things he noticed was that the Egyptian priests, the Egyptian religion, or the Egyptian year, began every year with the flooding of the Nile. That was the most important thing. And they timed the flooding of the Nile with the rising of one of these fixed stars. And I cannot recall which one it was. But one of the things that was really aggravating to them is that because this fixed star, when this fixed star would rise, the Nile would always flood like within a day or two of that. You know what I mean? It was like, but they wanted to keep their predictive ability alive. So they wanted to be able to predict more accurately when this, on average, the star would appear. And so what it looks like is every year what they would do is they would trace exactly when it happened relative to the flooding of the Nile, and then they would correct the calendar so that it would make it look like they were always right. You have to understand that the Egyptians were extraordinary spin doctors. That's what all those hieroglyphs are about, all of the pharaohs. That's spin, and the priests were responsible for much of that. But anyway, Ptolemy found out that the Egyptians had been doing this for a long time, which meant that they could observe it, but they couldn't quite explain it, and it was aggravating to them. So this is just another visual of this, a way of looking at this. This is our the 23 degrees that we are off. This is the plane of the ecliptic. This is the pole of the ecliptic. In other words, if the Earth was straight up and down, and it wasn't slanted a little bit, and this is the average precessional arc. Even the precessional arc varies a little bit, and the reason that we have these variations is partly because of things that happen in the solar system, and partly things that happen on Earth. For example, I don't know if you remember, I know that you remember the huge earthquake that occurred in Japan that caused that terrible tsunami. I'm sure, I know you remember that. Well, what a lot of people don't know is that earthquake was so large and displaced so much ground geologically that it actually increased the rotational speed of the Earth by a fraction. I mean, and so there are things like that that are happening all the time, on the Earth, that will slow the rotation or speed it up a little bit. And so due to all of these factors, as well as gravitational factors in the solar system, or, various things like that occur. I mean, I'm sure that when the Earth has been smacked by big meteorites, that has changed things too. You know what I mean? Changed the rotation or whatever. So all of those things will affect this number here. So that's like the average, but it can vary a little bit. So the issue was how to predict this and what does this mean? Well, so here's the guy who finally figured it out. His name is Ptolemy. As I say, he was a Greek dude who lived in Alexandria in the 2nd century. And he was a mathematical genius. And he had, because he lived in Alexandria and they had that library and it hadn't been destroyed yet, okay, he had access to all of these star charts from Babylon, from Egypt, Persia, and from all these places. And what he did was he noticed this thing, this precession of the equinoxes, and he figured it out mathematically. He figured it out. And he figured out how to predict it, which is really important. He also figured out that even by the time when he was doing this, and he did correct the calendar a little bit when he did it, he also found out that the constellations, see what had happened by astrology had changed a little by the time he was doing this. And so now we had constellations. And so when people did astrology, they had begun, the sky had been divided up into the 12 mansions that we now call the houses, you know, the houses, and they were called the mansions. And as your planets or the sun or whatever would move through these mansions, connected to certain constellations and then to the certain fixed stars, there were things that could be told of you about that. I think I mentioned that the Persians kind of invented the mansion thing. That's kind of what they did. And then the Greeks had picked that up. So he figured out that the mansions had already slipped. So now all the mansions have slipped since the time he corrected everything. All the mansions have slipped an entire sign. Okay, so, but like I said with the first astrological talk that I gave, sidereal astrology corrects for that. And so Jyotish, for example, which is Indian astrology, it is sidereal astrology. They correct for this. When I had my first Jyotish reading many years ago, I was really stunned to discover that I was actually a Cancer. It almost made me vomit in my mouth. Anyway, the other thing to understand about this dude here is that he was also the person, as you probably know, who gave us the geocentric theory of the world, you know, that everything revolves around us. That doesn't mean, however, that he believed that the earth was flat. He knew that the earth was not flat. In fact, most of the ancients knew that the earth was not flat. It doesn't take advanced mathematics to figure out that the earth is not flat, okay? The Egyptians knew it, the Greeks knew it, the Indians knew it, the Chinese knew it, the Mayan people in Central America knew it. It is not rocket science, okay? So even though he did say that everything revolves around the earth, he meant that just in a technical way. It wasn't the way that the church meant it later on, that's why we're so important. You know, he wasn't saying that. So here's another picture of Ptolemy that I included just sort of as a political comment. So you can see that later in European history, he becomes even more white. He was not white. He was Greek in North Africa.
Like Santa Claus.
Huh? You notice how
like Santa Claus.
Yeah, well, or Gandalf or Merlin.
Well, the red suit, you know.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He sort of looks. I thought he looked like Nostradamus here. The other thing that he did was, and this is what's really important for us, if you're going to be using fixed stars, he preserved all the old star lore, or a lot of it, about fixed stars. In other words, the legends and stuff that are attached to it, to the different stars. And he's known for 3 important works which survived because they became vital in the Islamic world. And one is his mathematical treatise, or the Almagest. That's a nice Arabic term for that, the Almagest. It literally means the big math thing. All right, and that's where he describes the precession of the equinoxes. And this became a very important text for Arabic astrologers and astronomers later on. He also wrote something called the Geography, which is a compendium of all the geographical information that Greeks and Romans knew at the time. And the Tetrabiblos, or the four books, in which he weds astrology with Aristotle. And that also became very, very important for Arabic astronomy later on. In fact, it's that book, the Tetrabiblos, that gets transplanted into the West at a certain point and becomes the basis for a lot of astrology and astronomy in the West at a certain point in the late Middle Ages. So Ptolemy was actually a really important guy, even though we like to make fun of him because we like to say, oh, well, Copernicus proved that he was wrong. Well, actually, Copernicus didn't prove that he was wrong. The person that proved that he was wrong was an Arab mathematician who proved that he was wrong. And Copernicus actually plagiarized this man's work and passed it off on his own, as his own. And the reason we know this is because there are a few mathematical miscalculations that Arab astrologer makes. He just makes these calculations, makes some mistakes, and those mistakes are copied exactly by Copernicus. So there you go. So, as I was saying, due to their relative reliability, fixed stars became the basis of predictive measure in early astrology. So these are just some examples of, you've got Ursa Minor here, here's Ursa Major right here, here's the Big Dipper right here, pointing at Polaris. There's Deneb, which is part of Cygnus, and Vega, which is part of Lyra. So basically, when you're looking at fixed stars, you're looking at really only two things. You're looking at what fixed stars are rising at the time of your birth, what fixed stars are closest to where your sun is, or if you're looking at any of the other planets, whether they are close to any of those other planets. And what fixed stars may be at the top, they've reached their culmination point. Because not all fixed stars, depending on the season and on your latitude, are going to rise to the same degree. Like, for example, in summer, Sirius is always present in the northern hemisphere, and it just kind of stays in one place throughout the summer months. And then in the fall, it begins to set. So, and then you also look at what stars are setting or on the horizon or descending, if you will, at the time when you were born. So you can apply this just to your sun, or you can apply this to any of the planets. Although actually a lot of times with fixed star astrology, like I said, they tend not to use the moon so much, because the moon moves so rapidly, across the sky in the night, or even during the day, it moves so rapidly. I mean, it's going to hit all the stars that are going to be there. So it's not really paid that much attention to. You might pay attention to if there's an eclipse or what phase the moon is in, but then that's not fixed star astrology anyway. That's looking at the moon. So that's all you basically do. And usually you look within 5 degrees. So this is why it's really important to know what latitude you were born at, because that will tell you precisely where your sun was relative to the rising or setting or culmination of various of these stars. And also, as the stars move through the sky, you'll notice some of them are always in kind of relationship with each other. So, for example, if your sun, say somebody's sun, you were born in the middle of the night, what that means is that your sun is actually on the other side. The sun is actually on the other side of the world, right? So what you do is you calculate that from the nadir. The nadir means the sun is on the other side of the world, essentially. So, but you can still calculate, what stars were rising at that time. So I was born still during the daytime. So and early evening stars were rising at the time of my birth. So if these, like say your sun at the nadir is going right through the middle of these three stars right here, you would have to look at, and each one of these is rising. They haven't reached the culmination yet. Then you would have to look at and it's all less than 5 degrees. If there's a relationship between the sun and a planet and a fixed star, it's called Paran, P-A-R-A-N, that they are in Paran relationship. And usually you only check stars that are within 5 degrees, no more than that. So obviously if your sun went right through here, you'd have to check the Paran on all of these, or check the relationship between all of these. So this is just an illustration here of where some people think the swastika came from, as an example. And you can actually see this yourself if you go outside. During the summer, and of course this is part of Ursa Major, during the summer, this is where the dipper looks like in relationship to the Polaris. In the spring like this, in the winter like this, in the fall like this. And if you think about how the swastika is thought of as a wheel, the wheel of the sun, the wheel of the sky, there it is right there. So the rising and setting is referred to as the phases of a star. So what is the star's phase? Well, it can either be rising, it can be culminated, it can be setting. Some latitudes, in some latitudes, the star remains constant and does not rise or set.
Is that on the horizon or around the pole star?
It'll be around the horizon. And the other thing, to be able to do this really, really well, it's really hard if you don't have horizons on all sides, which is why if you're living in a mountainous area or wooded area like I am, it's really hard to sight this. Part of the reason I like to use fixed stars is because it's a different kind of astrology. It's a 360-degree astrology. And you have to go out, to really understand it, you have to go outside and really actually look at the sky, which to me is really different than what a lot of astrologers do now. Where, you get the vital statistics for your chart and you plug it into a computer and you barf it out. And you have this wheel, and the wheel does supposedly represent what is in the sky, but it's not, I don't know, it's just on a piece of paper. And there are a lot of astrologers that I've worked with and who I respect that I actually wonder if they actually ever go outside and look at the constellations and the things that they're talking about. Because fixed star astrology grew out of people's love of the heavens and seeing, actually believing like the Persians did, or, the Cheyenne of North America believed that the stars were messengers and that they had things to tell us about our relationship to the earth and our relationship to each other and our relationship to the heavens. It's, I guess to me, it's just important. It's important to know that. I'm trying to look for a particular, oh, here it is. How to find the phase, the star phase of the moon. Oh, that's right. That's what I was looking for. If a star does not rise at a certain latitude, like you never see it, it's there, but you never see it. Or if it is always at a constant place, it doesn't rise or set relative to the horizon because of where you are, it's called being curtailed. So it doesn't go through the same phases, if you will. So some fixed stars will go through phases, others will not go through the same kinds of phases. I couldn't remember what it was called. I just call it being kind of stationary.
What
Go ahead.
What was it really called again?
It's called being curtailed.
Curtailed. Okay, that's what I needed. Thank you.
Now, let me just give you some examples of how this works, because this is actually kind of cool. Some of you are probably, or I mean, I don't know how, if any, any of you ever seen pictures of this medicine wheel?
Yes.
Okay, like photos of it?
Yes.
Okay, because this is actually a really famous medicine wheel, or as the Cheyenne call it, an oxamio. And it is now believed that this is a more recent version that was made probably about 800 or 900 years ago of a series of older medicine wheels, some of which are 2,000 or 3,000 years old, but up in Canada, but are almost exactly the same design and were clearly made by the Cheyenne or the Tzitzita. I think that's how they pronounce their own name. I'll have to see here. I'm probably pronouncing it incorrectly and will be corrected. I'll look it up in a second. But what's important about this medicine wheel is that it was used to cite the rising of 3 fixed stars, because these 3 fixed stars gave the time period in the summer for the Masaum ceremony, which the Cheyenne do not do anymore because there's no way for them to do it. But it was at one time the most important ceremony of their entire life, of their tribal life. And what they would do is and this is in Wyoming where this big wheel is, it's really a large wheel. And you notice that it's got a cairn in the center, and then it's got several cairns off to the side. And there are reasons for these cairns at these places. According to the book that I'll tell you about in a minute, basically what they would do is they would wait until Aldebaran appeared in the south. And it would appear very briefly before the light of the sky, the light of the sun would blink it out. They would wait to see when it appeared at dawn, because it always appears almost exactly at the summer solstice. It's like within a day or two of the summer solstice. And as soon as they saw it, then they knew that they would start to preparing for this ceremony. And the whole purpose of this ceremony was to reenact basically all the Cheyenne people as a whole. They were all nomads, and they lived in these little tribal units, these little family units scattered over a very large area. But all of their medicine men were connected. And so at this particular time of the year, they would all go to the medicine wheel, and the cairns were for them to lay in to cite these fixed stars. And they would lay in the cairns, because this wheel is actually situated on a high plateau on the side of a mountain, and it's kind of it's sort of slanted in a way, so it's like pointed in the direction that they would want to look. And so they'd lay in these cairns, and they would wait for these stars to appear. And as soon as they did, these medicine men would become runners, and they would run off to the various family tribal members, and then they would all gather together at a pre-appointed place, and they would perform this ceremony. And the ceremony lasted a number of days, and the entire ritual period was a period of like 60 to 70 days. It was quite a long time. First for everybody to come, and then to prepare for the ceremony, and then to do the ceremony. And what the ceremony really was a reenactment of the story of the Cheyenne people, and of them coming from a northern place and establishing themselves as hunters on the plains, and them reacquainting all of the families with each other as a people. That was the purpose of the ceremony. And at the time when the ceremony was just ending, Rigel was rising, and then in the middle of the ceremony, when they actually begin the ceremony proper, they would build like this big, huge lodge temple, tent thing, and it looked sort of like this on the inside. Each one of these is like a pole. There are 28 of these, and that represents, of course, the approximate days of a month, essentially. So they would begin their preparation for this when Aldebaran would rise, and then when Rigel was rising, that's when they were ending. And so Sirius, when Sirius was in ascendance, that's essentially when they were actually all gathered together. So this is the wheel, and this is the use of the wheel as was described by a medicine man, Red Hot. What was his name? His name was, what was his name? Red Hat, Edward Red Hat. He was the Cheyenne keeper of the sacred arrows. In the early part of the 20th century, because he was the last person to remember how the ceremony was done and some of the songs connected to it, he found an anthropologist who was willing to work with him for a period of several decades and write this all down. This is an artist's rendition of these are some of the medicine men entering and this is a simplified version of this. And when Edward Red Hat told him the story, he had not seen this medicine wheel. So his view of this medicine wheel was as it had been given down to him. Another place where we can see fixed stars being used, and this actually is important historically and politically in North America prior to white people ever getting here, are in some of the mound building cultures of North America, of which there are literally thousands of these sites in different parts of North America, ranging all the way from the Great Lakes all the way down to southern Texas, Louisiana, and as far west as Mound City in Kansas, going all the way east, almost to the Chesapeake. There are these mound there are often accounted to have been like three main mound culture movements, if you will, and they're called the Adena, Hopewell, and Mississippian cultures. It doesn't really tell you very much about them, actually. What they're looking at are just like pieces of pottery and that kind of stuff. What the mound really were about, they represent at least the Hopewell and the Mississippian cultures. What they represent are instances where new technology, agricultural technology, is coming into coming into North America from Central America, essentially. And people that are bringing this agriculture, maize and squash and beans, they're not just bringing the means by which to farm. That's part of it. But the farming is always accompanied by other things. It's accompanied by ritual. It's accompanied by mythology. It's accompanied by ceremony. And most importantly, in this instance, especially with the Hopewell and the Mississippian cultures, it was accompanied by a different political order, a different set of mythological structures. And some of the native people in North America took to it, and some of them really didn't. And if you actually dig deep into sort of the origin stories of, say, like the Cherokee or the Shawnee, or the Kickapoo, for example, or other groups, what you'll find is at the bottom of some of these stories is a conflict about how to accept agriculture, and whether they, in accepting agriculture into their lives, into their cultures, they would accept this whole kit and caboodle. And there are some reasons for this. part of what came with this was a different way of looking at the stars. The mound building cultures brought with them a different mythology, and we're trying to figure out what that mythology was. We have archaeological sites, but we don't have there's not a lot of writing, so there's you have to sort of try to figure out what these people believe. Well, some of the things that have been figured out is that if you're familiar with the constellation Orion, right? With the 3 stars and that look like the belt, and then the thing that's hanging down that's supposed to be his sword. Okay. Well, obviously it was not interpreted that way. It was a different constellation from these mound building cultures that were coming from Central America. They saw those three belt stars as being the edge of a severed wrist. The edge of a severed wrist. And that little thing pointing down was part of a thumb. And basically, what you see in Orion is during the winter months, this severed hand, will sink into the western horizon just before sunrise. And below the wrist is this thing that they called the Ogi, the portal that led to the Milky Way. Once a soul reached the Milky Way, the trip on the path of souls began that would lead to Cygnus. Now, they didn't call it Cygnus. They referred to Cygnus as this. It was a raptor. It was the judge of the dead. And once a soul began the journey on the path of souls, it would make its way to a great rift. If you look at the Milky Way at this point, it appears to split. There appears to be like a rift in the Milky Way, and the raptor would judge you. And if the raptor judged you as being good, you would go on in the large rift, which is where all the good dead went. But if not, you would go on into the small rift, and then you would sort of be recycled. All right. And this is a story that apparently came from Central America at some point. And they're trying to reconstruct this myth, essentially. But there's enough star information that has been preserved on pottery and other things to suggest certain elements of this. Now, there were lots of reasons why natives in North America that were being encouraged to accept this new fixed star mythology, if you will, or spirituality. There were lots of reasons why they might want to. After all, they get new agriculture, new foodstuffs, they get new food technology, if you will. Yeah, but the problem with it is that the mound building cultures that developed were also very hierarchical. They sometimes required human sacrifice. It was not always a good thing. Okay. And so, and the way they looked at different constellations, they had a different story about where the dead go. It was not always a happy time, So what you see happening in different cultures, like the Cherokee, for example, some of the Cherokee accepted this and became mound builders. Others did not. And that caused rifts even among the Cherokee about what they would do. Among the Shawnee, for example, some of the Shawnee accepted this and actually left with some of the people that started the mound building cultures when some of them returned to central Mexico. And some of the Shawnee actually went back with them and then later came back because they were like, nah, we don't like it down here. Okay, and all of these stories of migration are recorded, actually, are kept in the histories of these people. But they're based on these different mythologies or explained in these different mythologies that are written in the sky. And you can actually see this written on the ground as well. So if we look at different mound building sites in North America, this first one is in Alabama. And what you find is that you know, a lot of time, one of the things that made these mound building cultures very confusing to a lot of people is that when they started looking at them, is they found that a lot of these sites don't align to solstices or equinoxes, which is kind of unusual. Because usually when you have megalithic sites, those are the kinds of things that they align to, or, you know, or at least to the phases of the moon or something, you know. I mean, even that great ruin in Chaco, those ruins in Chaco Canyon align to the solstices and equinoxes and the 18-year cycle of the moon, all right? But when archaeologists started to look at other things, they noticed that the sites line up to where Cygnus sets or where Orion sets or rises. That's where they started to be able to reconstruct, oh, this is a different mythology. It's based on a different set of fixed stars and a different set of constellations. Now, because it's based on Cygnus and Orion, and of course these people didn't call it Cygnus and Orion, that's what we call these constellations and the fixed stars connected to them. Immediately, a lot of people were like, oh, these people must really be Egyptians, because the Egyptians also focused on Orion, right? Well, there's no evidence that they're Egyptians, all right? Their culture's from Central America. And why are they focused on Orion and Cygnus? Well, those are also very powerful configurations of stars. You know, in Northern Europe, those same 3 or those same 5 little stars that comprises Orion's belt and sword in Northern Europe they were called Frigga's spindle. You know, they were just called something else. See them and you call them something else. So, but this is just to show you how different cultures have used these fixed stars, sort of these same configurations of stars, and develop different constellations around them. So if you're going to use fixed stars in astrology, these are some first principles. This is what I do. You do need to focus on the time, place, and day of birth, obviously, just like if you were doing a regular chart. And that's mostly so that you can determine latitude. You need the latitude of where a person was born so that you can figure out what stars are rising or any on the horizon or any culminating or any setting. If you're just beginning, just use the sun. And then later on, you can add the other planets as you want to. When I'm doing a beginning natal chart for someone, I just use the sun. I know that would be blasphemy for some people, but I don't care. And the other thing is
I'm sure Her Majesty doesn't mind.
Her Majesty doesn't give a flying rat's butt. The other thing is what's important is that in this astrology, you only use the visible planets. So you don't use Uranus, Pluto, and Neptune. I tend not to use those planets anyway for anything terribly serious unless there's like a really tight conjunction. Like say you've got 3, my mother has 3 planets conjunct her Pluto. Well, then yes, I will talk about Pluto because you've got like all these planets in a bunch around Pluto. But you know, other than that, I pay passing mind to the outer planets because you know, they weren't discovered until recently. Although Uranus apparently can be sighted occasionally under certain conditions with the naked eye, but Neptune can't be. And so, frankly, it doesn't figure much into, you know, your everyday stuff. And those are generational configurations. You know, they're gonna refer to cohorts and to large social events and things like that. So if you're just looking at an individual's personal stuff or where to begin, I don't pay them a whole lot of mind. Then what you do is you look at what. Go ahead.
No, I've been thinking it's like, you know, if I were to like, I don't know, like it's like a thought experiment I do. It's like if I were to have myself go to the same place over and over and live these different lives with like where I knew I would forget who I was. And, you know, astrology would be one of the ways I would talk to myself. And it makes a lot of sense to not use the outer planets, because most of those places, you know, you would just use the visible planets.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I know that I'm probably speaking blasphemy, especially for all those people who want to use every minute asteroid that exists. And I'm just like, you know what? I just can't be that crowded. You know, and to me, it all becomes it becomes too psychological and too sort of navel focusing on me, you know. Much more interested in what my relationship to the larger cosmos is than I am to, I mean, I'm interested in myself, but, you know, I'm interested in what's out there.
That's heliocentric.
That's it. Yeah, well, I am, you know, I'm a Leo, so I am the center of the, so, but only our solar system. And we are at the edge of a galaxy, right? So I only use the sun, but I'll show you where you can get information for the rest of the planets if you're interested in that. You look at what important fixed stars are either rising, culminating, or setting, and are no more than 5 degrees arc from the sun, from your sun. Okay, so you look at where your sun is, and I'll show you how to do this in a sec. Where your sun is, and then are any stars on the horizon or rising, or any setting, or like right on the horizon, or are any close within 5 degrees of your sun. And don't do all the fixed stars in the sky. Just focus on a few, maybe 3 to 5 of the big ones, you know, because honestly, every star in the sky is a fixed star. You know what I mean? In that sense. So what people who did fixed stars tended to do is they just focused on the brightest ones, the ones that were most obvious. And you'll see those are the ones that recur all the time. Now, the other things that I focus on personally is I focus on stars whose rising and descending paths are crossing one another, if that's happening within 1 degree of the solar arc of a given sign or of your sun. So say your sun is at a certain place and one star is rising and is at the same place as your sun, but another one is descending and they're crossing each other very close to where your sun is. And so I'll look at that as well. Or are rising or setting together. So there'll be times when you'll have a sun here and you'll have 2 stars that are rising and they're at approximately the same parent from the sun. And occasionally I'll look at the constellation that they're in. You know, honestly, I don't pay that much attention to constellations because I've been studying other astrologies and star systems for so long now that I'm just like, is this Regulus or is this a dog or is this like the 5 hunters? You know, it becomes very confusing for me. And as I mentioned, usually the moon is not emphasized because of its cycle, and only the traditional inner planets are used. In traditional astrology, at least in the Western Hemisphere, the moon is not considered to be one of the inner planets. It's considered to be sort of its own thing. And you find this also in Mayan astrology, that the moon is just, you know, it's this dude that wanders around the sky, and it's useful for certain things. But it's not very useful for predictive things, essentially, because its arc is so quick, it's so fast, whatever it's doing. So only when it's connected to, you know, the full moon or its phases are important, or if it's connected to an eclipse. So these are the charts that you use in order to determine a rising and setting. These are the rising and setting charts. So let me see here, because I can't make these any bigger. Unless I can get out of this here. I'll make these bigger here. There, can you see those a little bit better? So these are for Aries. This is for, and these are rising at dawn. So this is the position of the sun in Aries. So this is the latitude. So this is where you're going to have to know where you were born. So say a person is born at my latitude, which is about 39. So it's right about here, right about here. And you were born 12, can you see this?
Yes.
And you
Yes, I can.
and you were born, say, 12 degrees in Aries, all right? Whatever that would be. Because I think that would actually be like May 1st or something, May 1st or 2nd. So you're like born like 12 degrees in Aries. So this is where your sun is going to be right here, and you're at 39 degrees latitude. You see right here. So this is about, so you can see here what stars are rising. So the important stars that you're going to be looking at, all these stars are rising. The important stars that you're going to be looking at are those that are going to be close, like this one right here. See these two that are crossing?
Mm-hmm.
See, that's an important thing to look at right here. And what you would do is you would just pick, what I would do is pick the most important stars. Not all of these are of equal importance, but I would always pick Formalhat. That's one of the Persian noble stars. I would always pick Markab. That's one of the important ones. All right. Algol, if that one's important at all. But see, where if you're here at like 39 right here, well, then these are kind of far away from you. But you can look at any of them if you want to. And what you do is you just take your pick. What she's doing is she's just presenting all, the person who created this chart. She's presenting, and her name's Bernadette Brady, and I'll show you her book in a minute. She's just presenting all the fixed stars that are available for you to look at, of which we have substantial information. Okay? You know, that they have lore connected to them. But the things that I would be this place here where these two, the lines of these two stars intersect. And then I would look at any other significant ones. Like I said, Formalhat, wherever Formalhat is.
So when you're looking at this, are you reading it vertically or horizontally or both?
You're looking to see where the vertical and horizontal meet.
Okay.
Because
and then whatever's the closest to that.
Yeah, that's where you are.
Okay.
Yeah, because see, here's the latitude right here. Here's the latitude that you're at. And then if you were born at like 12 degrees Aries, it would be right about here. Okay. It's where they meet.
And are those all the stars that would be important, like at that time? Like I'm just
yeah. See, the thing, which this is why this is divided into grid, because if you were born later, say a person is born in your same household, but they're born later in the month, then it would change. You see, what stars would be closest, would be more apparent.
And so I'm just wondering, like of the stars that like she's put on the chart, like why stars like Sirius wouldn't be on there?
Because Sirius is not in its ascendance at this point. It's present, but at this latitude, it's not going to be visible yet.
Okay.
You see.
So those aren't just, those are all of the...
These are the visible stars.
Okay.
These are the visible stars. I mean, obviously, there are stars that are going to be there, but they're not going to be visible. So that's how, and then these are the stars. These are the stars that are descending during the same time period. So that will be going, that would be go either lowering phase or setting. Okay, so and you would check both of these. So if you look at these, the ones that are setting, Algol is setting, Markhab is still setting. So it goes up and down in the course of an evening. You know, there's not a lot that is a lot different, because it's just over the course of an evening. You know, as the Earth moves around. See, what you do with fixed star astrology is you are visualizing when you were born at what the sky actually looks like when you go outside, what's actually there. You can calculate the nadir. In fact, if you're born at night, you're going to have to, because the sun isn't going to be there. It's going to be on the other side of the planet, but at least visible the other side of the planet. But this at least gives you a sense of what stars are actually where you are. All right. And it takes a little bit of practice, because you do have to go out, you have to visualize, you have to use a lot of visualization with this. And like I said, I've always found it really, really useful to actually just simply go outside and look. If I can't figure it out here, like if I can't figure these charts out here, I just go out and look. I find the chart that is connected to the time of day and night, that right at that moment. And I know somebody's born that day, right? So I just go outside and I just look to see what it looks like and how it's relative to these charts. Yes, yes.
Kat? I forgot my question.
Okay, well, you may remember it. So these are the books. These are some books. Let me show you this. This is the book on fixed stars, by the way. The book on fixed stars. Book of Fixed Stars by Bernadette Brady. What's cool about this book is she tells you how to do it, what it is, what the history of it is. For every single major fixed star that is used in the West, of which there are many, she includes all of Persia's stars, all the Babylonian stars, all the Greek and Egyptian stars, a lot of the Chinese stars, because a lot of those are similar anyway, they just have different names. But what's important is she includes like what Ptolemy says about them, what all of the main authorities have said about the fixed stars. She includes all that information, the stories behind them. And that's like the first part of the book is the explanation, and the second part is the stories about the stars, and the third part is about the constellations that they're in, the stories connected to those constellations. And then the next part of the book are all the different ways in which you can apply this, and all the different things you can do. So the book is about that thick.
Wow.
With lots of tiny print, lots of charts. She talks about the phases of each fixed star. There's a separate chart for each one. She goes through, and she just does the northern hemisphere. I mean, the southern hemisphere is a little different, obviously, and there are many, obviously there are many reasons for why a person might need a different book for that. We don't have a lot of lore about the southern hemisphere. It hasn't, at least that's available here. And then she has one little section of the book that if you want to use other planets, you can begin the process of doing that. Now, the other book that I included here, The Wolves of Heaven, I was talking about the Cheyenne medicine wheel, and this is the book that describes that ceremony. And the Wolves of Heaven here, the Wolves of Heaven, these represent, these were the two main characters that ended up playing an important role in this ceremony that I was talking about. But what's important about them is they represent the earth and the sky, and they also represent two of the fixed stars. So in a sense, they are embodying the, in this ceremony, they were embodying the messages of two of those fixed stars, one of whom was Sirius, and I believe the other one was Aldebaran, because it was considered that those were the stars from which the ancestors came. So they understood themselves as having originated in the stars somehow, or receiving messages from the stars. So that's why this is the wolves of heaven. So this is really a story about fixed stars, is what this is, and how the lore behind fixed stars informed an entire culture and their identity. And then these are some other additional sources that I thought you might find useful. Bernadette Brady, the same person who did the fixed star, she has also put together a book of star and planet combinations. So if you're going to be using fixed stars with the other planets, here's a whole book on it. If you go to Amazon, you'll find that there are other fixed star books. I still think Brady's is the most complete because she includes all the star lore, including all of Ptolemy stuff, Arabic stuff, Persian stuff, etc. For me, is going to be important. And for those of you who find anything about the mound building peoples interesting, this Path of Souls book by Gregory Little, there are some issues with this book, but the main part of the book is basically describing the current attempt by archaeologists to reconstruct this mythology that accompanied the bringing of agriculture to North America. And the various, it's a combination of looking at what archaeology is on the ground, as well as consulting various native authorities with regard to their oral cultures and what history was written down. So this is the book where you can find some of that information that is not, because a lot of it actually hasn't been written down academically yet. And that's it. That's it for the evening.
I remembered my question.
Okay, go ahead.
You keep saying to go outside and look. What about in areas with high light pollution?
That's a problem. In which case, what I recommend is, as sort of a secondary thing, get one of those apps for your phone. Get a star map app for your phone, because of which there are a number of them.
Which one do you use?
I use one that's called Star Map. Let me look real quickly.
That's fancy.
Yeah, I know. Hold on, let me look. Let me look. Yeah, it's called Sky Map.
Okay.
The Google store, and I think it's available as an app. And it's good enough, It'll help you. It'll help you find. It'll help you find the directions. It'll help you find what. And what's cool about it is it can help you find the nadir, because since it's linked to satellites, you can look at all the constellations that are that they would be seeing on the other side of the planet just by putting the phone down. You just, there's the nadir right there.
Yeah.
But that's what I would do, because where I live, we don't have a lot of light pollution, but we have a lot of trees. It's very forested. I live up on the side of a mountain, a little mountain. So, I don't have horizons. I've got right where the medicine wheel is in the backyard, I have one spot where I can look up like this. And it's pretty dark, but it's unless the fire department next door has their lights on. And so I can, right up above me, I can see, but that doesn't mean that I can see anything past it at all. Like I said, I never see Sirius. I know where it is, but I never see it.
That's weird.
It's blocked by trees. So I'm like, hi, Sirius in abstract. You know.
Okay.
Now, I am in a position where I can see Polaris really well. So I can see Polaris, I can see Ursa Major, I can see the winter constellations because to the north it's more clear. So
That's kind of cool.
but,
I read some time ago that the Pawnee relied heavily on astrology for some of their
they all do.
Rituals.
Yeah.
And I also read that it involved human sacrifice.
It did sometimes.
So it was one of those ugly things.
Well, the Pawnee are an interesting people. Their language is related to Central Mexican languages. They're of that language family.
Uh-huh.
And they were apparently of a group of people who migrated north and established mound cities, cities in the area that is now Missouri and Kansas. And then when those Mississippian cultures collapsed, which happened in the 18th century before people, and they collapsed as a result, or actually some of them even earlier, as a result of disease moving inland, even though they had not actually, many of the natives in the central part of the continent had never seen white people. All of a sudden they were swept with these diseases. And the Pawnee, their cities collapsed. And they were forced out onto the prairie, and they were forced to become prairie people when they were city people. And that kind of pissed them off, I think. And they were forced to have to compete with the Cheyenne and people who'd been out there for a while. And then the Lakota were forced out. They originally lived in around the Great Lakes. And then as groups of natives started coming west to try to escape from, white people, the Lakota got shoved. I mean, they also had a conflict with some Algonquin peoples there, and they got shoved west. And so they got shoved out onto the prairie too. So you have this situation where you have people who've been living on the prairie for a long time and suddenly having to deal with and compete with other groups. And that's part of where some of the animosity between these different groups come from. But the Pawnee maintains their old traditions. And one of them does involve periodic human sacrifice, which they don't do anymore, obviously, but they did do at one time. So, yeah. And the Pawnee were one group of people that everybody hated. Like all the other natives up there, they hated them, didn't trust them. And there's this whole story about the Cheyenne where, they had this ancient ceremony called the Masuam ceremony that I was telling you a little bit about, but they had other ceremonies too. And one of their more recent ceremonies, one of their most important prophets, a man named, in translation, his name means sweet medicine. And according to their tradition, he lived about 800 or 1,000 years ago. And he was the one who gave them the warning and the prophecies about white people coming. And, but he also gave them a special ceremony called the Broken Arrows ceremony. And this Broken Arrows ceremony was supposed to be a ceremony that would keep the people together even during really tough times. And it is one of the ceremonies that they maintain to the present day in a certain form. Well, during the 18th and 19th century, it was during the 19th century, when they were fighting the Pawnee at one point, the Shawnee were fighting the Pawnee. The Pawnee managed somehow to capture the medicine bundle for this Broken Arrows ceremony that connected them to sweet medicine. And there's this whole drama. There's a Wikipedia article about it. There's a whole drama about how they got part of the bundle back. The Lakota helped them get part of the bundle back. And they're connected to Bear Butte. Bear Butte, that contested area that they shared with the Lakota at a certain point. But what's interesting about this medicine wheel is that medicine wheel is used by almost all of the native groups that are up there. They all recognize that it is a Cheyenne wheel, but all the groups use it. So like the Blackfoot will use it, the Crow will use it, the Arapaho will use it, the Lakota will use it. Everybody uses it because of its inciting things. So, yeah, but yeah, the Pawnee, you know, I mean, the way I look at it, it's like, you know, we as white people don't need to have any opinions about this. This is native politics. This has nothing to do with us.
Part of the reason I read about it in the first place is because that's what I allegedly am, is part Pawnee. So maybe I won't pursue that.
Well, you know, it's you know, it doesn't hurt to know a little bit about your background, regardless of what that background is. You know, it's, you know, the way I look at it, you know, natives are people, and that there are bad and good things about all of their cultures. And, you know, we do not serve them or ourselves well at all by imagining them to be anything or anything else than what they are and what they want.
People.
You know? And, you know, because in either case, if we valorize and vilify them, we're denying them their humanity. So we have to, you know, I mean, we're coming at this, you know, whether we have native heritage in ourselves or not, you know, we're coming at this from a white perspective because we weren't raised with it. So regardless of what our genetic heritage is. So, you know, we don't have any, you know, we can have an opinion. I mean, I'm not a fan of human sacrifice, but my European ancestors practiced cannibalism and human sacrifice. So I'm hardly a person to cast stones upon those practices. You know.
So how do we get a chart like this done?
Well, when I do a chart for somebody that includes this, I just include it with their chart. You know, so like if they want a chart, just say, well, you know, give me your info because I need the same info.
Okay.
I need the same info because I need the latitude, you know, just like if you were having you know, for your ascendant, that's why you need that for your ascendant. You know, what's ascending, what's rising, you know. So I get the same information and then you just go from there. I have found that, so if I'm doing a natal chart for someone, I just include the fixed star stuff information in it. When I do a natal chart for someone, I do a real basic, it's a real basic natal chart. With just barely touching on the outer planets, then I'll do there's a fixed star portion, because it usually is pretty short. And I also do a little bit of Mayan astrology in there, because I've done some, you know. So I throw all that in, and then you can just say to the person, have a nice time with your life, because I only do transits a little bit like this. I do about this much with transits. Like I'll go to ephemeris and say, well, yeah, right now, you know, the moon is, or the Uranus is in blah, and it's making, you know, this angle to your blah, but it doesn't tell me anything about what's going to happen. That's what I hate about predictive astrology. It's like, it's not going to tell you anything about what's going to happen. All it's going to do is tell you what your choices are. These are your challenges. You decide what's going to happen. You decide what you're going to do. You know, I mean, all of astrology has become so psychological and narcissistic. When people used to do charts, they would just say, well, in Joytish now they'll say, well, here's your chart, and these are the things you can expect to happen. And yeah, you're going to, and sometimes they'll have very specific things that'll come up, you know, at certain points. Yeah, you're going to get married, this, whatever. You know, I had somebody do it, and like everything they said was wrong. Nothing that they said has come out the way it was. And that's because I make my own decisions about those things. You know what I mean? I've been known to decide against my chart because somebody said it was going to happen. Watch me. You know, but that's because I have a grand fixed cross, I've been told, and so I will act that way on occasion. But anyway, so if any of you want this done, I will be willing to do it. I do, however, charge for it. So I don't charge for much, but I do charge for charts.
How much then?
It depends on what you want done, but it's about $100 to do the whole thing. So
I would love to save up for that.
it's like entirely
That
up,
would be awesome.
entirely up to y'all. But, you know, if you just want me to look up some fixed star stuff for you, I can do that. But that's not that I still need your birth information. You know, just to do that. Like if you want to say, where is Sirius compared to me? And I'll be like, I don't know. I thought Sirius was dead. Or we can't do J.K. Rowling jokes anymore.
Oh, I think we can.
Because she's
Stories kind of belong to the world now. They're not necessarily hers anymore, you know?
well, that's kind of what I think. It's like people that are like, oh, you know, it's like, listen, I've already bought her stuff, so I don't care about, you know, I'm not going to give it up. It's like, this is my mythology. She can screw off. This is,
Yeah.
you know, I know I'm a Slytherin. I don't care. You know, I was a Slytherin in every one of those tests I ever took.
I was a Gryffindor in every single
I
one
am
of
so
those.
sorry. I would peg you as Ravenclaw.
Well, I don't. I don't know what, you know. Whatever.
Now hold on for just a second, because I'm going to stop this recording, because if we're going to blat, I don't need to record all of our blatting, right? So hold on just a second.